The Nazca Lines can be explained, at least in part, by understanding how they were physically made. Ancient people moved stones, exposed the lighter soil beneath them, and carefully organized enormous patterns across the desert. But knowing how something was built is not the same as knowing why it was built. And that is where the mystery becomes far more difficult. Because the Nazca people left behind no written explanation telling us what their lines meant, why certain animals were chosen, or what they expected these enormous designs to accomplish. Their civilization disappeared centuries ago, but the marks they left behind remain almost perfectly visible beneath the Peruvian sun. Today, archaeologists can study the landscape, compare the geoglyphs with other Nazca artifacts, analyze nearby settlements and ceremonial sites, and search for patterns in the placement of the lines. But ultimately, we are trying to reconstruct the beliefs of people who cannot speak for themselves. And perhaps the first mistake we make is assuming that the Nazca Lines had only one purpose. The landscape is too large, too diverse, and too complex for such a simple explanation. Some geoglyphs may have served different functions at different times. Some may have been connected to ceremonies. Others may have marked routes or sacred spaces. Some may have been associated with water, fertility, mountains, or supernatural beings. And some may still have meanings that we do not yet understand. To begin unraveling the mystery, we need to understand the world in which the Nazca people lived. Southern Peru is not an easy place to survive. The desert receives extraordinarily little rainfall, and agriculture depends heavily on access to water. Yet the valleys cutting through this barren landscape could support communities and crops. Water, therefore, was not simply a resource. It was a matter of survival. For ancient people living in such an environment, the forces controlling water, fertility, weather, and agricultural production would naturally have enormous importance. The mountains surrounding the desert could have been viewed not merely as geological formations, but as powerful places connected to supernatural forces. The sky, the sun, the stars, the seasons, and the movement of water through the landscape could all have been part of a larger religious worldview. When we look at the Nazca Lines through that perspective, they begin to look less like enormous drawings and more like a landscape designed for ritual activity. Imagine walking through the desert thousands of years ago. You are not looking down from an airplane. You are moving across the ground. Ahead of you is a narrow, cleared path extending toward the horizon. You follow it. The desert is silent. There are no buildings around you, no modern roads, no vehicles. Only the line beneath your feet and the mountains in the distance. Perhaps other people are walking with you. Perhaps you are part of a procession. You know where the path leads because your community has used it before. At a certain point, you arrive at a large open area. People gather. Offerings are made. Ceremonial activities begin. From above, someone thousands of years later might see a geometric shape. But from the ground, it is a place where people came together. This possibility has become central to many archaeological interpretations of the Nazca landscape. Rather than thinking of the lines as giant artworks designed primarily for aerial viewing, researchers have increasingly considered them as part of a ritual landscape in which movement itself may have been important. Some lines appear to connect different locations. Some are associated with large cleared spaces. Others form enormous geometric shapes. The act of walking along a line may have been part of the experience. The journey could have carried symbolic meaning. In this interpretation, the Nazca Lines were not simply something to look at. They were something to enter, follow, and experience. And if that is true, the question of aerial visibility becomes much less mysterious. The people who created the lines did not necessarily need to see the entire image. The image may have existed as part of a larger sacred system that only makes sense when the landscape is viewed as a whole. But then we encounter another question. Why animals? Why a hummingbird? Why a spider? Why a monkey? Why birds and other creatures? To answer that, we have to look beyond the desert floor and examine the wider artistic world of the Nazca culture. Archaeologists have discovered pottery, textiles, ceramics, and other objects decorated with animals, plants, supernatural figures, and geometric motifs. The same broad visual language appears in different forms across Nazca material culture. This tells us that the famous geoglyphs were not isolated creations. They belonged to a wider symbolic tradition. The animals were not necessarily chosen because the Nazca wanted to make giant pictures of things they simply admired. They may have represented ideas that were important to their religious worldview. Animals could be associated with supernatural powers, fertility, water, hunting, transformation, or the natural forces that shaped human life. But this is where caution becomes essential. We should not assume that every animal has a single obvious meaning. A modern person sees a hummingbird and immediately thinks of beauty, speed, or nature. An ancient Nazca person may have seen something entirely different. Symbolic meanings are cultural. Without written records, interpreting them requires evidence and comparison. This uncertainty is not a weakness of archaeology. It is the reality of studying an ancient civilization whose written voice has been lost. Another major theory connects the lines with water. First, the idea seems almost obvious. Why would people living in one of the driest environments on Earth not associate their sacred landscape with water? Some researchers have proposed that certain geoglyphs and lines may have been connected to rituals intended to influence rainfall, agricultural fertility, or water availability. In a desert environment, the relationship between human survival and the natural world would have been impossible to ignore. A successful harvest meant food. A failed season could mean hardship. Water was life. A religious system focused on maintaining harmony with powerful natural forces would therefore make sense. The lines could have been part of ceremonies asking for rain, fertility, or continued access to water. But again, the evidence does not allow us to say that every Nazca line was simply a prayer for rain. The landscape is far too complex. Different sites may have served different purposes, and the meaning of individual figures may have changed over time. Another intriguing possibility involves the mountains. In many ancient Andean cultures, mountains held enormous spiritual significance. They could be understood as powerful beings or sacred places associated with water and fertility. The Nazca landscape is surrounded by mountains, and some lines and geoglyphs appear to interact with the surrounding terrain. This has led researchers to investigate whether the desert markings were connected to mountains, water sources, and other sacred features. Perhaps the lines were not isolated designs at all. Perhaps they formed a network linking different elements of a sacred geography. Imagine a map, but not a modern map showing roads and political boundaries. Instead, imagine a spiritual map. A mountain represents a powerful sacred presence. A water source represents life. A settlement represents the human community. A line connects one place to another. A ceremonial area becomes a gathering point. The entire desert becomes a system of relationships. From the air, we see abstract geometry. From the perspective of the people who created it, the landscape may have represented an invisible world made visible through physical marks. This idea also changes the way we think about the enormous scale of the lines. Their size may not have been designed simply to impress. Scale can have symbolic power. A giant line stretching toward a mountain can create a sense of connection between human beings and forces far larger than themselves. A huge animal figure can represent a supernatural presence rather than an ordinary creature. A geometric form can transform a section of desert into a controlled ceremonial space. In this sense, the Nazca lines may have been a form of monumental architecture without walls. Instead of building upward, the Nazca built outward. Instead of raising temples from stone, they transformed the ground itself. The desert became their monument. And perhaps this explains why the Nazca lines feel so different from other ancient wonders. The pyramids of Egypt rise into the sky. The temples of Greece are made from stone. The great cities of Mesopotamia were built from enormous structures. But the Nazca people created something that almost disappears into the landscape. Their monument is not a towering building. It is the landscape itself. From the ground, it can seem almost invisible. From above, it becomes enormous. That contrast may have been intentional. It may have created a different relationship between the individual and the sacred landscape. You cannot fully understand the entire design from one location. You have to move through it. You have to experience it. Perhaps the mystery is not that the Nazca somehow created drawings they could not see. Perhaps they created a landscape that was never meant to be understood from a single human viewpoint. But there is another possibility that has fascinated researchers and the public for decades. Astronomy. Could the lines have been designed to mark the movement of the sun, moon, or stars? Could they have functioned as an enormous celestial calendar? The idea is undeniably attractive. The Nazca lived under a spectacular night sky, far removed from the light pollution of modern cities. The stars would have been brighter and more visible than almost anywhere people live today. Ancient societies around the world carefully observed celestial movements, and there is no reason to assume that the Nazca were uninterested in the sky. However, the popular claim that the Nazca Lines form a giant astronomical calendar is much more complicated than it sounds. Some alignments may correspond with celestial events, but not every line can be explained through astronomy, and the evidence does not support the idea that the entire Nazca landscape was simply a giant star map. This is an important distinction because the mystery of Nazca has often been distorted by sensational claims. Once a strange ancient monument captures the imagination, almost any unexplained detail can become evidence of something extraordinary. Suddenly, straight lines become runways. Animal figures become messages to extraterrestrials. Geometric shapes become landing sites. Ancient builders become secret engineers possessing technology centuries ahead of their time. But none of these ideas should be accepted simply because the lines look mysterious from the air. The real archaeological evidence points towards something much more human. These were communities capable of organizing labor, creating complex designs, participating in ceremonies, and transforming their environment according to beliefs that were deeply connected to the natural world. That explanation may sound less sensational than an alien spacecraft landing in ancient Peru, but it is far more consistent with what archaeology has actually found. Still, one mystery refuses to disappear. If these lines were primarily religious or ceremonial, why were some of them so enormous? Why create figures on a scale that seems almost impossible to appreciate from the ground? Perhaps scale itself was part of the ritual. Perhaps the lines were intended for supernatural beings rather than human spectators. Perhaps the creators believed their gods could see what humans could not. Or perhaps the complete figure was never the point. Maybe the process of creating it, the collective labor, the walking, the chanting, the offerings, and the ceremony were more important than the image itself. This possibility leads us toward one of the most fascinating ideas surrounding the Nazca Lines, that the people who created them may not have cared whether a human being could see the whole design. The desert itself may have been the sacred object. The act of marking it may have been an offering. The lines may have represented communication between the human world and the supernatural world. And if that was their purpose, then the famous question about how the Nazca could see their drawings from above suddenly becomes less important. Perhaps they never intended to see them. Perhaps they believed someone else was watching. Yet even this interpretation leaves us with an uncomfortable gap. We can identify possible ritual functions. We can see connections to the environment. We can compare the animals with Nazca art. We can study the geometry and distribution of the lines. But we still cannot reconstruct the exact thoughts of the people who made them. We cannot know what a particular hummingbird meant to a particular community. We cannot know what words were spoken as the first stones were moved. We cannot know whether a line represented a prayer, a pilgrimage, a boundary, a sacred route, or something entirely different. The desert has preserved the physical evidence but erased the human explanation. And perhaps that is why the Nazca Lines have remained mysterious for so long. They are not a puzzle with a missing piece that can simply be found and inserted. They are the remains of an entire worldview. A worldview in which humans, animals, mountains, water, sky, and the supernatural may have been deeply interconnected. To understand the lines, we are not simply trying to decode drawings. We are trying to reconstruct a civilization's relationship with the world around it. And just when we think we are beginning to understand that relationship, another question emerges. What if the lines were not only connected to what happened on the ground, what if some of them were deliberately aligned with something above it? The sun, the stars, the horizon, the mountains, or perhaps something the Nazca believed lived beyond the visible world? To answer that question, we have to look upward. And when we do, the mystery of Nazca becomes even stranger. For more than 1,000 years, the Nazca Lines remained hidden in plain sight. People walked across them. Travelers crossed the desert. Communities lived among the mountains and valleys surrounding them. And yet, the enormous figures remained almost invisible as complete images. It was only when modern observers began looking down from above that the true scale of the landscape became apparent. From the air, the desert suddenly transformed. Lines that seemed meaningless from the ground connected into enormous geometric patterns. Curves became animals. Shapes became recognizable figures. Paths became something much larger than paths. And this created one of the most enduring questions surrounding Nazca. If the people who created these designs could not see them from the sky in the way we can today, why did they make them so large and so carefully organized? The question sounds simple, but it hides an assumption. We assume that the purpose of a drawing is to be seen by the person who creates it. But what if that was never the purpose? What if the Nazca Lines were not designed for human eyes at all? What if they were part of a communication system directed toward the gods, ancestors, spirits, or forces of nature that the Nazca believed could see the world from above? To modern people, this idea can sound strange. But within many ancient religious traditions, the physical world was understood as part of a much larger supernatural order. Mountains could be sacred. Rivers could possess spiritual significance. Animals could represent supernatural powers. The sky was not simply empty space. It was a realm filled with celestial forces, cycles, and beings that could influence life on Earth. In such a worldview, creating a gigantic figure across the desert may have been less about showing it to another human being and more about placing a symbolic offering directly into the landscape. The desert itself could become a message. And yet, the mystery of the sky goes beyond religion. For generations, researchers have asked whether some of the Nazca Lines might have been connected to astronomy. The idea is tempting. Ancient people everywhere observed the heavens. They watched the sun rise and set. They tracked seasonal changes. They observed the moon and the stars. In an environment where agriculture depended on timing and environmental cycles, celestial observations could have practical as well as religious importance. So perhaps, some researchers wondered, the enormous lines were aligned with important astronomical events. Maybe they pointed toward the rising or setting positions of the sun at certain times of the year. Maybe some corresponded with stars or constellations. Maybe the entire desert formed a kind of celestial calendar. The idea became enormously popular. Images of Nazca Lines pointing toward the sunrise or sunset seemed to offer a tantalizing explanation for the strange landscape. But archaeology requires something more than an intriguing alignment. When there are hundreds or thousands of lines, some will inevitably point in interesting directions simply by chance. To demonstrate a true astronomical pattern, researchers need evidence that the alignments are statistically significant, culturally meaningful, and consistent with known practices of the people who created them. And that is where the idea of Nazca as a giant astronomical calendar becomes much more complicated. Some individual lines may indeed have astronomical relationships. Some orientations may have been deliberate, but there is no strong evidence that the entire Nazca system was designed as a massive astronomical instrument. The landscape is simply too diverse for one explanation to account for everything. And yet, even if astronomy does not explain all of Nazca, the sky may still have mattered. Imagine standing in the Nazca Desert at night nearly 2,000 years ago. There are no city lights, no illuminated buildings, no airplanes crossing the horizon, no artificial glow washing out the stars. Above you is an enormous sky filled with stars that modern city dwellers rarely experience. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness. The moon changes shape. The sun controls the rhythm of the day. The horizon is defined by distant mountains. For people whose lives depended directly on the environment, the movement of the heavens would have been impossible to ignore. The sky could have been a calendar, a source of orientation, a religious realm, or all three at once. But perhaps the most important clue is not the lines themselves. It is their relationship with the landscape. Some geoglyphs are located near natural features. Some lines travel across the desert toward mountains or other significant locations. This suggests that the Nazca landscape may have been designed as an interconnected system rather than a collection of isolated drawings. A line could begin at one point and lead toward another. A geometric shape could create a ceremonial area. A mountain could form the visual endpoint of a route. The horizon itself could become part of the experience. In that sense, the sky and the earth were not separate. They formed one continuous sacred environment. The Nazca people did not necessarily have to choose between worshiping the sky and worshiping the landscape. For them, the two may have been connected. But then there is the question that has fascinated popular culture more than almost any other. How could they create images that seem designed to be seen from above if they could not fly? This question became particularly famous in the 20th century, when researchers and writers began proposing explanations that moved far beyond conventional archaeology. One of the most influential popular interpretations suggested that the Nazca Lines might have been created for visitors from the sky. According to this idea, the straight lines were ancient runways, the geometric shapes were landing areas, and the enormous animal figures were signals designed to communicate with extraterrestrial beings. The theory is dramatic. It makes for an unforgettable story. But there is a fundamental problem. There is no convincing archaeological evidence that extraterrestrial visitors were involved in the creation of the Nazca Lines. The lines do not require advanced technology to explain their construction. Ancient people could create them using simple tools and coordinated labor. And the supposed runways do not behave like modern runways. Many are simply cleared geometric areas or pathways that make sense within the archaeological landscape without requiring aircraft. The alien explanation is therefore best understood as a modern cultural interpretation, not an established archaeological conclusion. Yet it became powerful because it exploited a genuine mystery. The Nazca Lines really are extraordinary. Their scale really is difficult to comprehend from the ground. Their creators really did live without aviation or modern surveying technology. And their original purpose really is not completely known. Those facts created the perfect environment for speculation. Once the idea of ancient visitors from the sky entered popular culture, every strange detail could be interpreted through that lens. The hummingbird became a signal. The spider became a symbol for beings from another world. The straight lines became landing strips. The geometric shapes became navigation markers. And suddenly the entire desert seemed to be sending a message into space. But there is another possibility that is much more subtle. Perhaps the Nazca people did not need to see the complete designs because they could understand them through partial views, elevated terrain, or repeated experience. The desert is not perfectly flat. Some hills and natural elevations provide viewpoints from which portions of the designs can be appreciated. Builders could also have used planning methods that allowed them to reproduce large-scale forms without ever seeing the entire finished figure. And if the purpose was ritual, the complete image may not have been important to the people on the ground anyway. This is a critical point. Modern observers are fascinated by the aerial perspective because it is the perspective from which the Nazca Lines became famous. But that does not mean the ancient creators shared our fascination. They did not live in an aerial world. Their experience was horizontal. They walked, they climbed, they looked toward mountains, they followed paths, they watched the horizon, they looked upward at the sky. Their understanding of the landscape would have been built from movement and memory rather than satellite imagery. A person walking along a line might never understand that the path was part of a giant hummingbird. But they could know that the path led toward a sacred place. They could know that their ancestors had walked it. They could know that a ceremony required them to follow it. The meaning of the line could exist independently from its complete shape. This possibility also helps explain why some Nazca geoglyphs are enormous. Their size may have been intended to create a sense of scale and sacred power. A human being standing beside a giant figure would be physically dwarfed by it. The landscape would communicate that something much larger than the individual was present. In religious architecture, size often matters. A giant temple can make a person feel small. A monumental statue can create awe. The Nazca may have achieved a similar psychological effect without constructing anything vertically. They used distance itself as monumentality. Instead of building a tower, they created a symbol that stretched across the ground. Instead of making something rise above the desert, they made the desert itself enormous. And then there are the lines that appear almost impossibly straight. Some travel long distances with remarkable consistency. To modern eyes, they can look as if they were produced by a machine. But straight lines are among the simplest geometric forms to reproduce using human observation and basic tools. A series of markers can establish a direction. Workers can align themselves visually. A rope can help maintain a path. Natural landmarks can provide reference points. The result can be surprisingly precise. Ancient engineers across the world demonstrated that complex construction does not always require complex machinery. What it requires is knowledge, organization, and time. The Nazca were capable of all three. But perhaps the strangest aspect of the sky mystery is that the more we learn about the practical construction of the lines, the less necessary the extraordinary explanations become. We do not need ancient airplanes to explain them. We do not need lasers. We do not need lost civilizations possessing futuristic technology. We need people who understood their environment and believed that transforming the landscape had meaning. Yet, eliminating one mystery does not eliminate all mystery. It simply moves the question. If the Nazca did not need aircraft to create the lines, what did they believe was looking down upon them? If the figures were part of rituals, who were those rituals intended for? If the lines connected sacred locations, what did those connections represent? And if the sky was part of their spiritual world, how exactly did celestial observations influence what happened on the desert floor? These questions remain open because the evidence is fragmented. Archaeology gives us stones, soil, pottery, human remains, settlement patterns, and geometric designs. It does not give us the thoughts behind them. We can reconstruct behavior more easily than belief. We can determine where people walked, but not always why they walked there. We can identify patterns, but we cannot always determine what those patterns meant. And that uncertainty is precisely what keeps Nazca alive as a mystery. The lines are not mysterious because they are impossible. They are mysterious because they are understandable in one dimension and almost completely silent in another. We understand how the desert was altered. We can study the techniques. We can date many of the features. We can compare them with other archaeological evidence. But the intention remains partly hidden. And perhaps the most fascinating discovery of all is that the Nazca landscape may be far larger than the famous photographs suggest. For decades, researchers focused on the giant animals and geometric figures that could be identified from aircraft. But modern technology is changing the way archaeologists search the desert. High-resolution aerial imagery, drones, advanced mapping techniques, and artificial intelligence are allowing researchers to examine enormous areas of terrain much faster than humans could do alone. And when machines began looking at the Nazca landscape in ways earlier generations could not, they started finding something remarkable. More lines, more figures, more traces of a civilization that may have left behind a much larger visual language than we ever imagined. The desert, it seems, still has secrets hidden beneath its surface. And that leads us to the final chapter of this mystery. Because if the Nazca Lines were already one of the greatest archaeological puzzles on Earth, what happens when modern technology begins discovering hundreds of previously unknown designs? What if the famous hummingbird, spider, and monkey are not the main story at all, but only the fragments we happen to notice first? The answer may be waiting in the desert right now, buried beneath thousands of years of dust and silence. And this time, the eyes searching for it are not human. They belong to machines. For generations, the Nazca Desert seemed to reveal its secrets only reluctantly. From the ground, it looked almost empty. From the air, it became one of the most extraordinary archaeological landscapes on Earth. The famous hummingbird, spider, monkey, and other giant figures transformed our understanding of what ancient people were capable of creating. But for all the attention these images received, researchers eventually realized something important. The famous Nazca Lines were only a fraction of the story. The desert was hiding much more, and as technology improved, humanity gained a new way to search for it. Instead of relying only on people walking across the desert or aircraft flying over known areas, researchers could now combine aerial photography, drones, high-resolution mapping, digital image analysis, and artificial intelligence to examine enormous sections of terrain in extraordinary detail. Suddenly, the question was no longer simply, what do we know about the Nazca Lines? It became something much more exciting. What have we not discovered yet? For centuries, the desert had been waiting, and now, machines were beginning to look at it in ways human eyes never could. The importance of this technological shift becomes clear when we understand the landscape itself. The Nazca region is vast. Thousands of lines and geoglyphs are spread across an enormous area. Some are obvious from the air, while others are faint, damaged, partially buried, or difficult to distinguish from natural features. Some designs are enormous and immediately recognizable. Others are much smaller and can disappear into the surrounding terrain. From the ground, identifying them can be extremely difficult. Even from the air, researchers must examine vast amounts of imagery. A human investigator can spend hours studying a single section of desert, searching for subtle patterns. Artificial intelligence, however, can process enormous quantities of visual information and identify shapes that deserve closer examination. This does not mean that AI magically understands ancient civilizations. It does not. Instead, it acts as a powerful search tool. It can compare patterns, detect unusual shapes, and help researchers narrow down locations that might otherwise take years to investigate. And in the Nazca Desert, that capability produced extraordinary results. In 2024, researchers from Yamagata University in Japan, working with IBM researchers, announced the discovery of hundreds of previously unknown Nazca geoglyphs using field surveys, aerial imagery, and artificial intelligence. More than 300 new figurative geoglyphs were identified in a remarkably short period of research. The discovery was significant not simply because of the number of new figures, but because it suggested that the archaeological landscape of Nazca was far more complex than previously understood. The famous images we see in documentaries and textbooks may represent only the most visible pieces of a much larger system. Imagine standing in the desert and knowing that beneath the ground in front of you may be a figure that no modern human had ever consciously recognized. The lines may have been there for nearly 2,000 years, surviving heat, wind, and the passage of countless generations. People may have walked within meters of them without understanding what they were seeing. Then, one day, an algorithm examines an aerial image and identifies a pattern. Researchers investigate the location. They compare the imagery with field observations. And suddenly, a forgotten figure begins to emerge from the desert. This is where the Nazca mystery takes an unexpected turn. For decades, the central question was whether ancient people could create these enormous designs without modern technology. Now, modern technology is helping us discover how much of their work we had failed to notice. In a strange way, the story has come full circle. The ancient Nazca transformed the desert using simple tools. Modern researchers are transforming our understanding of that same desert using sophisticated technology. One civilization altered the landscape. Another is learning how to read it. And the more researchers find, the more complicated the story becomes. The newly identified geoglyphs are not all giant animals like the famous hummingbird. Many are smaller and more difficult to recognize. Some depict humans or human-like figures. Others represent animals or scenes that may have had symbolic or social significance. Their scale and placement may provide clues about how the landscape was used. This distinction is important because it may reveal that the Nazca Lines were not one unified project created for one single purpose. Instead, they may represent multiple traditions developing across different periods. Some designs may have been intended for ritual activity. Others may have marked pathways. Some may have been associated with communities, religious practices, or particular locations. The landscape may have evolved over generations, with new designs added to an already meaningful environment. In other words, the Nazca Desert may have been less like a single ancient artwork and more like a massive cultural archive. Every line could represent an action. Every figure could represent a belief. Every pathway could preserve a memory of people who once moved through this landscape. And because the Nazca people left no surviving written explanation for the entire system, every new discovery has the potential to change how we interpret what came before it. This is why the recent discoveries matter. They do not simply add more pictures to a catalog. They provide additional evidence about the society that created the landscape. If certain types of figures repeatedly appear in particular locations, that may reveal patterns. If smaller geoglyphs cluster near pathways, settlements, or ceremonial areas, that could tell researchers something about how people moved through the region. If particular symbols appear together, they may provide clues about religious beliefs or social practices. Each discovery becomes another piece of a puzzle that may never have a single final answer. But there is something else about the new discoveries that should make us reconsider the way we imagine ancient civilizations. We often think of the ancient world as a place where progress stopped thousands of years ago and modern technology simply rediscovered what had been forgotten. But the Nazca story suggests something different. The people who created these lines were not waiting for modern science to validate their intelligence. They already understood their environment well enough to transform it. They developed systems of organization, artistic expression, engineering, and ritual that made sense within their own world. The fact that we do not fully understand those systems does not make them primitive. It makes them different, and perhaps that is one of the most important lessons hidden inside the Nazca mystery. The temptation to explain the unknown with extraterrestrials, lost supercivilizations, or impossible technology often comes from a simple assumption. If we do not know how ancient people achieved something, then they must have had help. But archaeology repeatedly tells a different story. Ancient people were capable of extraordinary things. They built cities, organized enormous labor forces, developed calendars, engineered irrigation systems, navigated oceans, and created monumental art without the technologies we take for granted. The Nazca Lines belong within that larger history of human ingenuity. Their mystery does not become less fascinating when we remove the aliens. In many ways, it becomes more fascinating, because now the question becomes, what was happening inside the minds of ordinary human beings that inspired them to create something on such an enormous scale? What did they believe? What did they fear? What did they hope for? What did they ask from their gods? And what role did the desert play in their understanding of existence? Those are questions technology alone cannot answer. AI can locate a buried geoglyph. A drone can photograph it. A satellite can map it. Archaeologists can date associated materials and compare the figure with other evidence. But no algorithm can simply open a window into the mind of someone who lived 2,000 years ago. Technology can reveal the physical remains of a civilization, cannot automatically recover its worldview. That is where interpretation begins. And interpretation must be careful. The discovery of new geoglyphs does not prove every theory about Nazca. It does not suddenly validate claims about extraterrestrials. It does not prove that the lines formed an ancient airport. It does not confirm that every shape was an astronomical instrument. Instead, it gives researchers more evidence with which to test competing explanations. The more evidence we have, the more precisely we can ask the right questions. And perhaps the most important question is no longer, how did they build the Nazca Lines? We have a fairly good understanding of the basic techniques. Nor is it simply, can we see them from the air? We know that aerial observation dramatically changes our perception of them. The deeper question is, what kind of society creates an entire landscape for purposes that remain meaningful centuries after the society itself has disappeared? That question reaches far beyond Nazca. It is a question about humanity. Across history, civilizations have left behind monuments whose original meanings became fragmented or forgotten. Stone circles, temples, burial grounds, enormous earthworks, ancient cities, and sacred landscapes all force modern people to confront the same uncomfortable truth. We can preserve objects far longer than we can preserve the beliefs that gave those objects meaning. The Nazca Lines may be one of the clearest examples of that phenomenon. The desert preserved the marks. It did not preserve the explanation. And perhaps this is why the landscape feels almost haunting. The figures seem to communicate something, but there is no voice behind them. The hummingbird does not speak. The spider does not explain itself. The monkey cannot tell us why its enormous tail curves across the earth. The straight lines continue toward distant horizons, silent and indifferent to the people who now study them. They have survived kings, wars, migrations, climate changes, and the collapse of the civilization that created them. And now they are entering a new age, an age in which satellites can photograph them from orbit. Drones can fly directly above them. Algorithms can search millions of pixels for patterns invisible to the human eye. Artificial intelligence can help identify new shapes that researchers might otherwise overlook. It is possible that the next major discovery is already hidden somewhere in the desert, waiting for someone to recognize it. Perhaps it will reveal a new animal, perhaps a new geometric pattern, perhaps a previously unknown type of ceremonial site, or perhaps it will challenge one of the theories we currently believe to be strongest. And that possibility is what makes the Nazca story far from finished. The archaeological record is still expanding. Every new discovery changes the map. Every new excavation adds another piece of evidence. Every technological improvement gives us a better view of a landscape that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. We may eventually understand much more about why the Nazca created these extraordinary markings. But there is also a possibility that some questions will remain unanswered forever. We may never know exactly what a particular figure meant. We may never know why one line was placed in one direction and another in a different direction. We may never know what ceremonies took place along specific paths or what words were spoken as the stones were moved. The people who created those moments are gone. Their language, their stories, and their private beliefs have largely disappeared into time. What remains is the landscape, and perhaps that is enough to tell us something profound. The Nazca Lines are not simply mysterious drawings in a desert. They are evidence that human beings have always tried to communicate with something larger than themselves. Sometimes they build temples. Sometimes they carve mountains. Sometimes they raise monuments toward the sky. And sometimes they transform an entire desert into a message that can survive for nearly 2,000 years. We may never know exactly who that message was meant for, but we know someone cared enough to create it. Someone walked across this land. Someone moved those stones. Someone imagined a shape larger than themselves and believed it was worth the effort. And today, when we look down from the sky and see the ancient figures emerge beneath us, we are not simply looking at an archaeological mystery. We are looking at the surviving footprint of a civilization that once had its own explanation for the world. A world where the earth and sky may not have been separate. A world where mountains could be sacred, animals could carry supernatural meaning, water could determine survival, and a line drawn across the desert could become an act of devotion. The mystery of Nazca may never be completely solved, but perhaps that is not a failure. Perhaps the purpose of archaeology is not always to eliminate mystery, but to replace speculation with better questions. And after everything we have learned, one question remains above all others. Not who built the lines, not how they were constructed, not even whether they were meant to be seen from the sky. The question is much more human. What did the Nazca people believe they were saying when they turned their desert into one of the largest and most mysterious canvases in human history? For now, the desert keeps that answer. The lines remain, the mountains remain, the sky remains, and beneath the endless Peruvian sun, thousands of ancient marks continue to wait, silently reminding us that sometimes the oldest mysteries are not hidden because they are impossible to understand, but because the people who knew the answer disappeared long before we thought to ask the question.